Canada's winter had always carried a quiet majesty, but this year, the snow seemed heavier, its silence more oppressive. In the city of White Hollow, nestled deep within the Rockies, the streets shimmered with frost, and the homes were dressed in festive lights that blinked lazily beneath a thick blanket of white. It was December, and Christmas was only a week away. Yet, despite the idyllic holiday tableau, an unshakable tension hung in the air, unnoticed by most but deeply felt by the few who dared to look closer. White Hollow was no stranger to snowfall, but the storms this year had been relentless. Roads were frequently buried, and the sun seemed to have forgotten the town entirely. Days blurred into nights under the same ashen sky, where only the faint glow of street lamps fought to keep the darkness at bay. Residents bustled about their holiday preparations, visiting the local shops for gifts or gathering in the town square to admire the towering Christmas tree. But there was a peculiar stillness in their movements, as if some unseen force was urging them to hurry home before nightfall. The city's mayor, Regina Moore, tried to lift spirits with a grand tree-lighting ceremony planned for Christmas Eve. White Hollow is a place of community and tradition, she declared at a recent town hall meeting. We won't let a little snow dampen our holiday cheer. Her words were met with muted applause, but even she couldn't ignore the whispers. People spoke of strange occurrences, a lone figure wandering the outskirts of town during blizzards, lights flickering in empty buildings, and an eerie hum that could be heard late at night when the winds died down. Among those who noticed these oddities was Evelyn Carter, the owner of the local diner. Evelyn had lived in White Hollow all her life and prided herself on knowing everyone in town. But lately, there had been faces she didn't recognize. Travelers who arrived during the storms, only to vanish as mysteriously as they came. She would often find herself gazing out the frosted windows of her diner during her late-night shifts, her unease growing as the snow fell in thick, suffocating curtains. One evening, Evelyn's suspicions deepened. She had stayed late to clean the diner, the world outside muffled by the ever-present snow. At precisely 11:13 p.m., the power flickered. For a moment, the diner was plunged into darkness, save for the pale glow of the snow-covered streets outside. Evelyn rushed to the window, her breath fogging the glass as she peered into the night. That was when she saw it, a tall figure standing in the middle of the road, motionless, its face obscured by a hood. The figure seemed to watch her, though she couldn't be sure. Then, without warning, it turned and disappeared into the swirling snow. The next morning, the city buzzed with news of a discovery near the edge of town. A young couple, returning home late from a holiday party, had found a trail of footprints leading into the woods. The prints were enormous, far too large to belong to any human, and they stopped abruptly as though their maker had simply vanished. The couple reported their findings to the police, but the officers who investigated dismissed the story as nothing more than an animal wandering too close to town. Still, the unease spread like a contagion. Even the children of White Hollow felt the change. Their laughter, once ringing joyfully through the streets as they built snowmen and played in the drifts, grew quieter. They whispered to each other about the snow stalker, a creature they claimed came with the storms, its presence marked by the strange humming sound that haunted the town at night. Parents brushed off these stories as childish imagination, but many of them found themselves locking their doors a little earlier than usual. At the town's library, a group of teenagers decided to investigate the rumors. They pored over old newspapers and archives, searching for any clue about the mysterious figure or the strange footprints. What they found was unsettling. A pattern of disappearances and bizarre incidents that occurred every 20 years, always in December, always during unusually harsh winters. The last recorded event was in 2003, when a man named Leonard Price had vanished without a trace during a Christmas Eve snowstorm. His case remained unsolved. As night fell once again on White Hollow, the unease turned to dread. Evelyn, locking up her diner, couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The snow seemed to muffle not just sound but her very thoughts, the weight of the silence pressing against her chest. She glanced down the street and saw the glow of the Christmas tree in the town square, its lights flickering like a heartbeat in the cold night. It was meant to be a symbol of hope, but to Evelyn, it felt like a warning. In the distance, a church bell rang, a deep, mournful sound that echoed through the empty streets. Evelyn froze. The bell tower had been abandoned for years, its mechanism rusted and silent. And yet it tolled, its cry carrying through the snow like a lament for something long buried. The next morning brought no relief to White Hollow. The sun remained hidden behind an endless expanse of gray clouds, and the snow continued its unrelenting descent. The bell tower's ominous toll the night before had left the town in a state of hushed apprehension. Whispers filled the streets, and those who dared to speak of it speculated wildly. Some claimed it was a prank. Others spoke in hushed tones about ghosts. Evelyn Carter, however, could not shake the memory of the hooded figure she had seen the night before. She felt as if the tolling of the bell had been a reply to her unspoken fear. Across town, the bell tower itself became the center of attention. A group of curious townsfolk, led by Gregor Willis, the town's handyman, gathered to inspect the ancient structure. Gregor was a pragmatic man, quick to dismiss talk of the supernatural. Probably just the wind rattling some old gears, he declared, though the quiver in his voice betrayed his own unease. Armed with flashlights and tools, he climbed the rickety staircase to the bell chamber, leaving the others to wait below in the cold. When he returned 20 minutes later, his face was pale and his hands trembled. "The mechanism is completely rusted through," he said. "It shouldn't have been able to move." Word of Gregor's discovery spread quickly. By noon, nearly everyone in town knew about the bell, though opinions were divided. Mayor Regina Moore called for calm, urging the townsfolk to focus on the upcoming Christmas Eve celebration. "We can't let superstition overshadow the holiday spirit," she announced, though she herself avoided the subject of the bell entirely. For some, her words were enough to quiet their fears, but for Evelyn and others who had witnessed the stranger or heard the hum, the mayor's reassurances rang hollow. That afternoon, as the snowstorm intensified, a new visitor arrived in White Hollow. The stranger appeared without warning, trudging into town from the direction of the woods. He was a tall man with a gaunt face, wrapped in a heavy coat and scarf that obscured much of his features. His boots were caked in ice, and his eyes carried the weight of someone who had seen too much. He introduced himself only as Mr. Drake and claimed to be a historian researching old towns in the region. He rented a room at the local inn and kept mostly to himself, though his presence was hard to ignore. Mr. Drake's arrival coincided with an increase in strange occurrences. Evelyn noticed that the hum, which she now heard almost nightly, seemed to grow louder and closer. Others began reporting unusual phenomena: lights flickering even when the power was stable, objects moving slightly out of place, and a sense of being watched that was impossible to shake. Despite this, the townsfolk clung stubbornly to normalcy, attending choir practices and decorating their homes in preparation for Christmas. It wasn't long before Mr. Drake visited Evelyn's diner. He sat at the counter, ordering a black coffee and studying her intently. "You've seen it, haven't you?" he asked suddenly, his voice low. Evelyn stiffened, her hand hovering over the coffee pot. "Seen what?" she replied, though she knew exactly what he meant. "The figure in the snow," he said. "The one that watches but never approaches. You're not the first to see it." Evelyn set the pot down, her hands trembling. "What do you know about it?" she asked. Mr. Drake leaned closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "There are stories, old ones, about towns like this, isolated during harsh winters. They speak of something ancient, drawn to places where the snow never stops. It comes with the storms, feeding on fear and loss." He paused, his eyes scanning her face. "If you've seen it, you're already marked." The weight of his words hung in the air, suffocating Evelyn with their implications. She wanted to dismiss him as a crackpot, but the intensity in his gaze made her hesitate. "Why would it come here? What does it want?" she asked, her voice trembling. "That," Mr. Drake replied, "is something we need to figure out before it's too late." The conversation left Evelyn shaken. She closed the diner early that evening, unable to focus on her work. As she walked home, the hum began again, faint at first but steadily growing louder. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, resonating in her bones. She quickened her pace, the snow crunching beneath her boots, until she reached her front door. The moment she stepped inside, the hum stopped. That night, Evelyn dreamt of the figure in the snow. It stood just beyond her window, its hooded face turned upward as if watching her sleep. When she woke, her breath was visible in the icy air of her bedroom. The window was ajar, though she was certain she had locked it before bed. By the next morning, White Hollow was caught in the grip of a storm so fierce it seemed to erase the edges of the world. The snow fell in a suffocating cascade, piling high against doorways and windows, forcing residents to stay indoors. For Evelyn Carter, the hours dragged on in oppressive silence, broken only by the occasional gust of wind that howled through the streets like a living thing. She found herself constantly looking at the windows, half expecting the hooded figure to appear again. Despite the weather, Mr. Drake remained active. Bundled against the cold, he trudged through town, knocking on doors and asking questions. Many residents turned him away, uneasy with his probing curiosity. However, a few confided in him, sharing fragments of their own unease, objects disappearing, the feeling of being followed, or dreams of shadowy figures standing at the foot of their beds. The stories painted a disturbing picture, one that Mr. Drake compiled in a leather-bound journal he carried everywhere. Evelyn didn't see Mr. Drake again until late that afternoon when he returned to her diner. She had reluctantly opened for the day, despite the storm, hoping the routine of work might distract her from her growing fear. He sat at his usual spot by the counter, this time ordering tea. "It's getting stronger," he said without preamble. His tone was grave, his eyes scanning the diner, as if expecting the walls themselves to listen. "What is?" Evelyn asked, her voice low. "The presence," he replied. "It feeds on fear, and this town is brimming with it. Have you noticed how the snowstorm worsened overnight? That's not coincidence. It's the storm." Evelyn stared at him, her hand tightening on the edge of the counter. "You're saying the storm is alive?" "Not alive in the way you and I are," Mr. Drake clarified. "But it's tied to whatever is haunting this place. The more we fear it, the stronger it becomes. That's why we need to stop it before it's too late." Evelyn wanted to laugh at the absurdity of his words, but deep down, she knew he was right. The storm had an unnatural weight, a malice that went beyond mere weather. "How do we stop it?" she asked, though the question tasted bitter in her mouth. Mr. Drake hesitated, his fingers drumming against his journal. "I don't know yet," he admitted, "but I've seen this before. Other towns, other storms. It always starts the same way. The disappearances will come next." The weight of his statement settled heavily over Evelyn. She thought of the stories she had read, the legends whispered by the teenagers in the library. Could this really be happening again, after so many years? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the diner's door creaking open. A blast of icy wind filled the room as a man stumbled inside, his face pale and his breath coming in ragged gasps. "I saw it," he said, collapsing onto one of the chairs. His name was Henry Jacobs, a middle-aged mechanic who lived on the outskirts of town. His hands shook as he spoke. "It was standing in my yard, just standing there, watching me through the window. When I opened the door, it was gone. But the snow..." He stopped, struggling to catch his breath. The snow was moving, like it was alive. Mr. Drake leaned forward, his expression intent. "Did it try to come inside?" "No," Henry replied, his voice trembling. "It just stood there, but it left something." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small object, a crude wooden carving of a hooded figure. The wood was old, splintered, and covered in frost that didn't melt despite the warmth of the diner. Evelyn recoiled at the sight of it, an inexplicable wave of nausea rolling over her. Mr. Drake, however, examined it closely, his brow furrowing. "This is a warning," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's marking you. It wants you to know you're next." The diner fell silent as his words sank in. Outside, the wind howled louder, rattling the windows and sending a shiver through the small group gathered inside. Evelyn looked at Henry, whose face was a mask of fear, and then at Mr. Drake, who seemed both fascinated and horrified by the object in his hands. For the first time, she realized that the storm was not just an external force. It was inside them now, feeding on their terror, growing stronger with every passing hour. As night fell over White Hollow, Evelyn closed the diner early once again, unable to shake the image of the wooden carving from her mind. She locked the doors tightly and drew the curtains, but sleep refused to come. In the dark, she could hear the hum again, louder than ever, as if it were calling her name. The night was darker than Evelyn had ever known it to be. The streetlights, usually a comforting glow against the endless white of winter, flickered weakly before succumbing to the storm's might. The town's power grid had failed, plunging White Hollow into an oppressive silence broken only by the relentless wind. Evelyn sat in her living room, a candle casting flickering shadows on the walls. Despite the warmth of the fire, she shivered, her ears straining to catch the faint hum that had haunted her for days. Across town, the situation was no better. Families huddled together in their homes, barricading doors and windows with anything they could find. The storm had escalated to a full-blown blizzard, the kind that swallowed sound and space, making even the shortest walk outside a perilous journey. Yet, amidst the chaos, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. Reports spread of missing pets, their paw prints trailing off into the snow and vanishing abruptly. A child claimed to see a shadowy figure standing at the edge of their backyard, its form barely distinguishable against the swirling white. Evelyn couldn't stay idle any longer. Wrapping herself in layers of clothing, she ventured to the diner to check on supplies. The streets were empty, but the sensation of being watched was overwhelming. She glanced over her shoulder repeatedly, but there was nothing, just the wind and the snow. Still, her pace quickened, her boots crunching through the deep drifts. When she reached the diner, she found the door slightly ajar. Her heart sank, and she hesitated before stepping inside. The interior was as she had left it, save for one detail. The crude wooden carving Henry had brought earlier was now sitting on the counter. She distinctly remembered locking it in the supply closet before closing. Her hands shook as she approached it, and the hum she had grown to dread filled her ears, louder and more insistent than ever. Behind her, the sound of a chair scraping across the floor made her whirl around. No one was there, but the chair by the window had been pulled out, as if inviting someone or something to sit. Evelyn's breath quickened, and she backed toward the door. Suddenly, a figure appeared in the snowstorm outside, standing motionless at the edge of visibility. It was the same hooded shape she had seen that night, but now it felt closer, more tangible. The figure raised a hand, pointing directly at her. Evelyn froze, her mind screaming at her to move, to run, but her body refused to obey. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure dissolved into the storm, leaving only a faint outline in the snow. The hum ceased, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. Evelyn didn't wait to see if it would return. She grabbed the carving, wrapped it in a dish towel, and fled back into the storm, determined to confront Mr. Drake. At the inn, Mr. Drake was waiting for her, as if he had known she would come. He ushered her inside quickly, locking the door behind her. His room was cluttered with maps, books, and notes, all detailing similar incidents in towns like White Hollow. "It's escalating faster than I expected," he said grimly when she explained what had happened. Evelyn handed him the carving, and his expression darkened. "This isn't just a warning," he said, turning it over in his hands. "It's a tether. As long as this stays in your possession, it will follow you. It's chosen you." His words sent a chill down her spine, colder than any winter wind. "What does it want from me?" she demanded, her voice breaking. "To feed," Mr. Drake replied. "It doesn't just take people. It consumes their fear, their hope, their very essence. And it uses the storm to trap its prey, isolating them until there's nothing left." He paused, his gaze intense. "If we're going to stop this, we need to sever its connection to you. That means getting rid of the carving, but not in the usual way. Destroying it won't work. We need to take it back to where it first appeared." Evelyn's stomach churned at the thought of returning to Henry Jacobs' yard, the last known place where the figure had been seen. But she nodded, knowing she had no choice. "When do we leave?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "Tonight," Mr. Drake said, "before the storm gets worse." As they prepared to venture back out into the night, Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that the hooded figure was watching her, waiting just beyond the edge of the storm. She didn't know if they would survive the night, but one thing was certain: whatever haunted White Hollow wasn't finished with them yet. The storm howled like a living beast as Evelyn and Mr. Drake set out into the night, the crude wooden carving wrapped tightly in Evelyn's scarf. The streets of White Hollow were unrecognizable, buried under layers of snow that blurred the lines between road, sidewalk, and wilderness. The air itself felt thick, as though the storm was pressing down on them with malicious intent. Evelyn clutched her flashlight tightly, its beam struggling to cut through the swirling white. Their destination was Henry Jacobs' house, perched on the edge of town where the snowdrifts piled highest. Mr. Drake led the way, his leather-bound journal tucked under one arm and a metal flask in the other. "Keep your mind clear," he advised, his voice barely audible over the wind. "It feeds on confusion and fear. Don't let it in." Evelyn nodded, though her heart pounded in defiance of his words. The trek felt endless, each step a battle against the biting cold and the nagging sense that they were not alone. Shadows moved at the edges of Evelyn's vision, indistinct forms that disappeared when she turned to face them. She couldn't tell if they were tricks of the storm or something far more sinister. Mr. Drake seemed unperturbed, his focus fixed on the path ahead, but Evelyn caught him glancing over his shoulder more than once. When they finally reached Henry's house, it stood like a spectral monument against the storm, its windows dark and lifeless. Evelyn's breath hitched as she noticed the snow outside the house had been disturbed. Patterns swirled into strange, deliberate shapes that defied logic. Mr. Drake crouched down to examine them, his brow furrowing. "These aren't natural," he muttered. "They're sigils. It's claiming this place." Evelyn's unease deepened as she followed him to the porch. The front door was ajar, swinging gently in the wind. Inside, the house was deathly silent, its warmth drained by the cold that seeped through every crack and crevice. "Henry," Evelyn called out, her voice trembling. There was no reply. They searched the house room by room, their footsteps echoing in the emptiness. In the living room, they found a disturbing scene. A circle of candles surrounded by more of the crude wooden carvings, each one pointing toward the center. Evelyn's stomach churned as she recognized the hooded figure replicated in each carving, its features grotesquely detailed. "This is a summoning ritual," Mr. Drake said grimly, stepping into the circle. But it wasn't done properly. He must have tried to banish it on his own. He pointed to a smear of blood on the floor, leading toward the back door. And it didn't end well. The back door hung open, revealing a trail of footprints leading into the woods behind the house. Mr. Drake hesitated before following them, his hand tightening around the flask he carried. Evelyn had no choice but to follow, every fiber of her being screaming for her to turn back. The woods loomed ahead like a wall of shadows, their skeletal branches clawing at the sky. As they delved deeper into the forest, the storm seemed to grow quieter, its howling replaced by an eerie stillness. Evelyn noticed the footprints became erratic, zigzagging and doubling back, as though Henry had been running from something. Then abruptly they stopped. In their place was a hollow in the snow, as if someone had lain down and vanished. Evelyn's flashlight flickered, its beam dancing across the trees. That was when she saw it, a figure standing just beyond the reach of the light. It was the hooded specter, its form impossibly still against the swaying trees. Evelyn's breath caught as its head tilted, acknowledging her presence. Before she could scream, Mr. Drake grabbed her arm. "Don't look at it," he hissed, dragging her away from the clearing. "It's testing you. If you give in to the fear, it will take you too." They stumbled back toward the house, the storm closing in around them like a suffocating shroud. By the time they reached the porch, Evelyn was shaking uncontrollably. Mr. Drake closed the door behind them and turned to face her, his expression grim. "This isn't just about Henry," he said. "It's anchored to this town now. The storm, the sigils, the carvings, it's building its power. If we don't stop it soon, No one in White Hollow will be safe. Evelyn sank into a chair, her mind racing. The hooded figure wasn't just haunting the town. It was consuming it, piece by piece. And now, she was marked by it, tethered to its growing power. As the storm raged outside, she realized that their battle had only just begun. The storm showed no signs of relenting as Evelyn sat at the dining table in Henry Jacobs' house, her fingers trembling around the steaming cup of tea Mr. Drake had prepared. Outside, the wind howled like a chorus of unseen voices, carrying an unsettling cadence that seemed to echo the hum she had been hearing. The walls of the house felt as if they were closing in, the air heavy with the weight of something unspoken. Mr. Drake rifled through a stack of Henry's papers spread across the floor. Maps, notes, and faded photographs lay scattered, some torn, others marked with cryptic symbols that matched the sigils they had seen in the snow. He was trying to decipher its origins, Mr. Drake murmured, more to himself than to Evelyn. Henry wasn't just caught in this. He knew about it long before it showed up. Evelyn's curiosity broke through her fear. What do you mean? He summoned it, didn't he? Drake shook his head, holding up a photograph of a much younger Henry, standing in front of a decrepit cabin in the woods. No, he didn't summon it. He was running from it. Look at this. He handed her the photo, and her stomach churned as she spotted the faint silhouette of the hooded figure in the background, barely visible between the trees. That's decades ago, Evelyn said, her voice barely a whisper. It's been following him all this time? Not just him, Drake said grimly. He laid out a map of White Hollow and began marking locations. Henry's house, the diner, the woods, and other places Evelyn recognized as the homes of townsfolk who had gone missing over the years. This thing doesn't just haunt individuals. It anchors itself to communities, feeding on their collective fears and secrets until there's nothing left. Evelyn's mind raced as she thought of the strange disappearances that had plagued White Hollow over the decades. A teenager who vanished while sledding, a family who never returned from a Christmas tree hunt, a mailman whose route ended abruptly one snowy afternoon. All written off as tragic accidents in a harsh climate. But now, the pattern was unmistakable. Why now? Evelyn asked, her voice breaking. Why is it escalating? Drake's gaze was unyielding. Because it's been waiting. The storm isn't just weather. It's a barrier. It's isolating the town, trapping everyone inside so it can consume us. As the weight of his words settled over her, Evelyn felt a deep sense of dread. She had spent her entire life in White Hollow, a town that had always seemed so quiet, so safe. But now she realized it had been living under a shadow all along, its snowy charm masking something far more sinister. Their conversation was interrupted by a loud bang at the door. Evelyn jumped, her heart pounding as she turned toward the sound. Mr. Drake motioned for her to stay quiet, grabbing a poker from the fireplace before cautiously approaching the door. The banging continued, more urgent this time, accompanied by a voice yelling to be let in. "It's me! Open up!" Evelyn recognized the voice immediately. It was Sam, a young man who worked at the grocery store and had been one of the few people to brave the storm for deliveries. Drake opened the door, and Sam stumbled inside, covered in snow and out of breath. "Thank God I found you," he gasped. "Something's out there. It's taking people." Sam's story tumbled out in fragments. He had been making his rounds when he saw shadows moving through the storm, darting between houses. He followed them to the old church at the edge of town, where he found the doors blown open and a crowd of carvings arranged in a circle around the altar. "They weren't there before," he said, his eyes wide with terror. "And there was this noise like a low hum, but it felt like it was inside my head." Drake's expression darkened as he exchanged a glance with Evelyn. "The church," he said, more to himself than to anyone else. "That's where it's building its power. If we're going to stop this, we need to act now." Evelyn's stomach churned at the thought of returning to the church, a place she had always associated with peace and sanctuary. But now, it had become the epicenter of something far darker. As the three of them prepared to head out, the wind outside seemed to shift, carrying with it a sound that chilled Evelyn to her core, a low, resonant hum that echoed in perfect harmony with her growing fear. For the first time, she realized just how deeply the storm had seeped into the fabric of White Hollow, turning everything she thought she knew into a lie. The hooded figure wasn't just haunting the town. It was unraveling it one thread at a time, and unless they found a way to stop it, there would be nothing left of White Hollow to save. The snowstorm battered White Hollow with relentless fury as Evelyn, Drake, and Sam made their way toward the old church. The wind cut through their layers, biting into their skin, and the once familiar streets now seemed foreign, transformed into a maze of shifting shadows and swirling snow. Evelyn clutched a flashlight, its beam weak and flickering against the white void. Every step felt heavier, not just from the snow, but from the oppressive weight of fear pressing down on her. The church loomed ahead, its steeple barely visible against the dark sky. Once a beacon of comfort for the community, it now seemed menacing, its silhouette jagged and unnatural. As they approached, the sound of the low hum grew stronger, vibrating in Evelyn's chest and mingling with the howling wind. Sam hesitated, his breath visible in rapid puffs of air. "Are we sure about this?" he asked, his voice trembling. Drake didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stopped and turned to them. "This isn't just about us," he said firmly. "Whatever this thing is, it's feeding on the town. If we don't stop it, no one will." His words hung in the air, a fragile resolve holding them together as they pushed forward. The church doors were ajar, swinging gently on their hinges despite the lack of visible force. Evelyn felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold as she stepped inside. The air was different here, heavy and still, as if the storm outside had been swallowed by the building itself. The hum was louder now, almost deafening, and it seemed to emanate from every corner of the space. The interior of the church was unrecognizable. Pews were overturned, their wood splintered as though struck by some immense force. The altar was no longer a place of reverence, but a macabre display. Strange carvings covered its surface, symbols that matched the ones Henry had been studying. Arranged in a circle around the altar were objects that didn't belong. Photographs, pieces of clothing, and trinkets Evelyn recognized as belonging to people from the town. Sam recoiled, his hand covering his mouth. What is this?" he stammered. Evelyn felt bile rise in her throat. "It's a shrine," she said, her voice barely audible. "It's marking its victims." Drake moved closer to the altar, his movements deliberate and cautious. He studied the symbols, his fingers tracing the grooves with a mix of fascination and dread. "This isn't just about fear," he said, his voice steady despite the growing tension. "It's creating a tether. These objects, they're anchors. It's binding itself to the town through them." As Drake spoke, the hum shifted, growing deeper and more resonant. Evelyn felt it in her bones, a vibration that made her teeth ache. The candles lining the walls flickered to life spontaneously, their flames unnaturally still despite the draft. Shadows danced across the walls, their movements erratic and disconnected from the light source. Suddenly, Sam let out a strangled cry. Evelyn spun around to see him backing away from one of the stained glass windows. The glass, once depicting a serene nativity scene, now showed something grotesque. A warped figure with hollow eyes and twisted limbs, its form writhing as if alive. The image seemed to press against the glass, testing the boundary between the spiritual and the physical. "We need to leave," Sam shouted, panic overtaking him. "Not yet," Drake said firmly, his eyes fixed on the altar. "If we destroy these anchors, we might weaken it." Evelyn hesitated, torn between her own growing terror and the sense of duty to her town. She reached for one of the photographs on the altar, the face of a missing teenager staring back at her. Her hand trembled as she tried to lift it, but the moment her fingers touched the surface, the hum surged, and she felt an overwhelming wave of nausea. The air around her seemed to distort, the room spinning as a disembodied voice whispered in her ear. "You can't stop it," the voice hissed, cold and mocking. "It has already begun." Evelyn stumbled back, clutching her head as the hum receded slightly. She looked at Drake, who was now gripping a piece of cloth from the altar, his face pale but determined. "We don't have a choice," he said, his voice strained. "If we don't fight back now, we'll lose everything." As the hum grew louder again, Evelyn realized there was no turning back. Whatever was happening in White Hollow had rooted itself deeply, but the church was clearly its heart. They had to act quickly, even if it meant risking their lives. With a deep breath, she steeled herself and moved closer to the altar, ready to face the darkness that had claimed her town. The frigid air inside the church clung to Evelyn's skin as she stepped closer to the altar. Each movement felt heavier than the last, as though the oppressive energy in the room were trying to root her in place. Drake and Sam stood behind her, their faces pale but resolute. The flickering candlelight cast long, distorted shadows across the warped symbols carved into the altar, and the hum in the air seemed to take on a rhythm, like a heartbeat echoing through the ancient wood. Drake knelt beside the altar, his hands trembling as he sifted through the cursed artifacts. A knitted scarf, a child's toy car, a worn leather wallet. Each item seemed to pulse faintly as he touched it, as though resisting his grasp. "These aren't just symbols of the victims," he muttered, his voice hushed and grim. "They're reservoirs. It's feeding off the emotions tied to these objects. Fear, grief, despair." Sam, still shaken by the twisted images in the stained glass windows, hovered near the doorway, his gaze darting nervously around the room. "If it's feeding off these things, then maybe destroying them will weaken it," he said, desperation creeping into his voice. "But what if we're wrong? What if we make it worse?" Evelyn turned toward him, her jaw set. "We can't just stand here and do nothing. If we don't try, it'll keep growing and more people will vanish." Her words carried more conviction than she felt, but the alternative, doing nothing, was unthinkable. As if in response to her defiance, the hum shifted again, growing louder and more dissonant. The candles flared brighter, their flames stretching unnaturally high before plunging the room into darkness. A moment later, they reignited, but their light was dim and eerie, casting an otherworldly glow over the altar. The distorted image in the stained glass seemed to writhe, its hollow eyes fixed on the trio. Drake didn't wait for further signs. He grabbed the scarf and held it over one of the candles, its edges curling and blackening as the fabric caught fire. The hum spiked, and a deafening wail filled the room, a sound that wasn't entirely physical but seemed to resonate in their very minds. Evelyn clutched her head, tears streaming down her face from the sheer pressure of the noise. The moment the scarf was reduced to ash, the wail stopped, replaced by an unsettling silence. Evelyn's ears rang as she straightened, her heart pounding. The atmosphere in the church felt lighter, though only slightly, as if one strand of the malevolent force had been severed. "It worked," Drake said, his voice hoarse. He reached for the next object, a tarnished locket, but froze as the room seemed to shudder. The shadows on the walls grew darker and more defined, coalescing into a single form. From the far corner of the church, a figure emerged. At first glance, it looked like a man, but its movements were jerky and unnatural, as though its joints were misaligned. Its face was obscured by a swirling void, and its elongated fingers ended in sharp, claw-like points. It tilted its head toward them, emitting a guttural growl that vibrated through the floorboards. Sam let out a strangled cry, stumbling back toward the door. "What the hell is that?" he shouted, his voice cracking. Evelyn stepped in front of Drake, her flashlight trembling in her hands as she pointed it at the creature. The beam of light seemed to have no effect, the void where its face should have been absorbing it completely. "It's guarding the altar," she whispered, her breath visible in the freezing air. The creature lunged without warning, its movements fluid and unervingly fast. Drake rolled out of the way, narrowly avoiding its claws as they gouged deep marks into the altar. Evelyn swung her flashlight at it, the metal connecting with a sickening thud, but the creature barely flinched. It turned toward her, its growl deepening. "Burn another one," Evelyn shouted at Drake, keeping her flashlight raised defensively. Drake scrambled to his feet and grabbed the locket, fumbling with the candle as the creature closed in. The moment the locket ignited, the creature let out an agonized shriek, its form flickering and distorting like a malfunctioning projection. Evelyn took the opportunity to shove it back, her adrenaline overriding her fear. As the locket disintegrated, the creature dissolved into shadows, retreating to the far corner of the room and disappearing entirely. The silence that followed was oppressive, broken only by their labored breathing. Evelyn's hands shook as she lowered her flashlight, her knuckles white from gripping it so tightly. "This thing, it's not going to let us destroy these easily," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Drake nodded, his face pale but determined. "Then we'll just have to fight harder," he said, reaching for the next object on the altar. Sam swallowed hard, his fear palpable, but he stepped forward to join them. Together, they prepared for the next battle, knowing that whatever lay ahead would only grow more dangerous. But beneath their terror was a flicker of hope, fragile but unyielding. If they could weaken the force, perhaps they could save White Hollow from the darkness consuming it. The three left the church just as dawn began to break, the pale light struggling to pierce through the thick blanket of snow that continued to fall over White Hollow. The town felt even more desolate than before. The streets were eerily silent, with no signs of life. No cars, no pedestrians, only the faint whistle of wind weaving through abandoned buildings. The trio trudged through the snow, their breaths visible in the icy air, their minds weighed down by the encounter. Evelyn kept glancing over her shoulder, her nerves frayed from the events inside the church. The memory of the shadowy creature flickered in her mind like a warning. "We need to regroup and figure out what's next," she said, her voice sharper than intended. "Whatever we're dealing with isn't just feeding off emotions. It's defending its source." Drake nodded, cradling a small satchel filled with ash from the objects they'd burned. His steps were heavy, but his determination remained firm. "We're making progress." Destroying those artifacts did something. The air felt different in there after that thing retreated. Sam trailed slightly behind, his flashlight clutched tightly in his hand despite the growing daylight. His face was pale, and his usual bravado was noticeably absent. "Different doesn't mean better," he muttered. "That thing, it wasn't just protecting the altar. It was testing us. What happens when it stops holding back?" Evelyn didn't respond. She had no answer to Sam's question, and the weight of their situation pressed harder with each step. As they reached the edge of the town square, something caught her eye. A figure stood motionless in the distance, almost indistinguishable against the snow-covered landscape. It was a woman, her long hair hanging limp over her shoulders, wearing a tattered red coat. "Do you see that?" Evelyn whispered, stopping abruptly. Drake followed her gaze and stiffened. "Yeah, she's just standing there. Don't approach her," Sam said, his voice trembling. "People don't just stand in the middle of a blizzard like that." But Evelyn felt an inexplicable pull, as if the woman were calling to her without words. "We can't just leave her there. What if she needs help?" she said, taking a cautious step forward. The woman turned her head slowly, revealing a face that was both hauntingly beautiful and unnervingly blank. Her eyes were like black voids, reflecting no light, and her lips moved soundlessly as if she were speaking. Evelyn froze, her instincts screaming at her to run, but her legs wouldn't obey. The woman raised an arm and pointed toward the north, where the forest loomed like a shadowy wall at the edge of town. Then, as suddenly as she had appeared, she disintegrated into a flurry of snow, leaving no trace behind. "What the hell was that?" Sam yelled, his voice breaking the silence. Evelyn turned to Drake, her face pale but resolute. She was pointing toward the forest. "Whatever we're dealing with, it wants us to go there." "That's a trap if I've ever seen one," Sam said, shaking his head vehemently. "We can't just walk into the woods because a ghost told us to." Drake looked between them, his expression torn. "We've been reacting to this thing the whole time. Maybe it's time we take the fight to it. The altar was just the start. It's hiding something bigger." Evelyn felt a chill that had nothing to do with the snow. "If we're going into that forest, we need to be prepared for anything. This thing is playing with us. It's testing our limits." The three stood in the empty square, the weight of their next decision heavy in the air. The forest loomed ahead, dark and foreboding, as if it were alive and waiting. Despite the fear that clung to them like frost, they knew there was no turning back. Whatever lay within the woods was their next step, their next challenge, and possibly the key to saving White Hollow. The forest loomed before them like a dark sentry, the towering trees casting long, oppressive shadows even in the faint light of morning. The snow was deeper here, the ground blanketed in a thick, undisturbed layer that muffled their steps as they approached the tree line. The quiet was overwhelming. No birds, no rustling of animals, just the weight of silence pressing down on them. Evelyn felt the familiar cold creeping through her clothes, but it wasn't just the temperature. There was something in the air, a tension that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. Drake seemed equally uneasy, his eyes scanning the woods with a mixture of curiosity and dread. "We're close," he muttered, adjusting the strap of the satchel, holding the ashes of the destroyed artifacts. The bag had become a strange talisman, something they clung to, as if the very remnants of what they had burned could somehow protect them. But Evelyn wasn't so sure. The woman in the square, her disintegration into snow, the eerie quiet, had only heightened her sense of foreboding. Sam, trailing behind them, nervously glanced over his shoulder. "This place feels alive," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Like something's watching us. We shouldn't be here." Evelyn turned to him, her face set with determination. "We don't have a choice, Sam. That thing, whatever it is still out there, and it's tied to this place. We're following the only lead we have." Sam gave her a reluctant nod, but his unease was palpable. "I just don't like it. We're walking into the lion's den, and we don't even know what's waiting for us." They pressed forward, the crunch of snow beneath their boots the only sound breaking the otherwise suffocating silence. The forest felt different here, older, more oppressive. The trees twisted and contorted, their branches gnarled like skeletal fingers reaching toward the sky. It was as if the forest itself had been touched by the same darkness that had settled over White Hollow. The snow, though deep, seemed to have no effect on the trees, their twisted forms unchanged by the passage of time. Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that the trees were closing in on them, their branches creaking with an unnatural rhythm. As they walked deeper into the woods, the air grew colder, sharper, and she noticed how the snow began to fall in a way that didn't make sense. Clumps of it fell in slow, deliberate bursts like raindrops frozen in time. Drake's pace slowed, his eyes narrowing as he looked ahead. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his voice tense. Evelyn strained her ears, trying to discern any sound beyond the howling wind. At first, there was nothing, just the eerie stillness of the forest. But then a soft, almost imperceptible whisper floated through the air, so faint it could have been a figment of her imagination. "What is that?" she whispered, her breath catching in her throat. The whisper grew louder, more distinct, and with it came an overwhelming sense of dread. It was a voice, low, guttural, and strangely familiar. "You shouldn't have come." The words, though soft, vibrated with a power that made Evelyn's skin prickle with fear. Sam's eyes widened in terror. That's not human," he said, his voice trembling. But Evelyn couldn't turn back now. She felt something pulling her forward, a force greater than her fear. She took a step, then another, her boots crunching in the snow. The voice continued to echo around them, now more like a chant, a rhythmic whisper in the wind. "You shouldn't have come. You shouldn't have come." Drake reached out and grabbed her arm, pulling her back. "Wait," he said, his face pale. "There's something wrong with this place. We need to be careful." But Evelyn shook off his grip, her gaze fixed ahead. "No, this is what it wants. It's trying to turn us back. It's trying to break us." With that, she pressed on, determined to face whatever lay ahead. The forest seemed to shift as they moved deeper into its heart. The trees parted slightly, revealing a clearing up ahead. In the center of the clearing stood an ancient stone structure, partially buried in snow and overgrown with vines. The air around it was thick with an unnatural fog, swirling around the stones like a living thing. Evelyn's heart raced as she approached the structure. It was a monument of sorts, but not one she recognized. The stone was dark, almost black, and its surface was etched with symbols that seemed to pulse with a faint, malevolent energy. At the top of the monument, a large, jagged crack ran down the center, as if the stone had been split open by something ancient and powerful. Drake stepped up beside her, his breath shallow. "This is it," he whispered. "This is what we came for." The voice in the wind seemed to grow louder, now no longer a whisper, but a wail, a scream that reverberated through the very ground beneath their feet. "You should have stayed away." As the words echoed, the air grew colder, the fog thickened, and the ground beneath them began to shift. The trees surrounding the clearing groaned and creaked, their branches bending unnaturally. Evelyn took a step back, her heart pounding, but she knew they couldn't stop now. They had come too far. Drake, his face etched with fear but determination, reached into his satchel and pulled out a small vial filled with the ashes from the burned artifacts. "We need to destroy this thing before it destroys us." The ground trembled beneath them, and Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. The forest wasn't just watching them now. It was coming to life. The fight for White Hollow had begun in earnest. The air in the clearing had grown thick with an unnatural cold. Evelyn stood frozen, her eyes fixed on the jagged stone structure ahead of them. The ground beneath her feet trembled slightly with each echo of the wailing voice that had once again filled the air, reverberating through the trees as if the forest itself were alive, watching them. She could feel the energy pulsing from the stone like a heartbeat, deep and powerful, as if it were somehow drawing strength from the very land around them. The fog that swirled around the monument was not like the fog of a normal winter's morning. It had substance, a heaviness that clung to her skin and made it difficult to breathe. Every inhale felt like pulling in the cold itself, leaving a bitter, metallic taste on her tongue. The sight of the ancient symbols carved into the stone sent a shiver down her spine. Each glyph seemed to twist and writhe as if alive, etched by hands that knew darkness in its purest form. Drake was beside her, his hand clutching the vial of ashes tightly, but he too seemed hesitant. The trembling of the earth beneath them had grown stronger, like something ancient was awakening. It wasn't just a feeling, it was tangible, like the pressure of a storm waiting to break. His voice broke through her thoughts, low and strained. "We need to make this quick, Evelyn. Whatever is in that thing, it's not going to let us destroy it without a fight." She nodded, the determination in her eyes sharpening. "We don't have a choice, Drake. If we leave now, the town will fall. This place is connected to everything, White Hollow, the disappearances, the curse. It all leads back to this stone." Sam, still standing a little farther back, looked as though he were going to argue, but the wail that echoed from the trees silenced him. The voice was louder now, more urgent. "You shouldn't have come. You shouldn't have come." It wasn't a warning anymore. It was a threat, an ancient force trying to claw its way free. Evelyn turned to Drake, her fingers tightening around the hilt of the small, silver knife she'd brought with her. "We need to break the stone open. We have to expose whatever is inside before it's too late." Her voice was calm, but there was a dangerous edge to it, a determination that hadn't been there before. She had no illusions about what they were facing now. It wasn't just an entity from the past. They were dealing with something much older, something that had rooted itself deep into the land. Drake hesitated, then nodded grimly. "I'll do it," he said, stepping forward toward the monument. He uncorked the vial of ashes, his hand steady despite the palpable dread that seemed to hang in the air. The fog thickened, swirling around his feet like a living thing, and Evelyn could almost hear the forest holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. As Drake reached the base of the stone, the wailing voice rose again, louder and more frantic. "You don't know what you're doing," it cried. "This is your last chance. Turn back." But there was no turning back now. Drake pressed the vial of ashes against the crack in the stone, and in that instant, the air seemed to crackle with energy. The ground trembled violently beneath their feet, and a low growl emanated from the monument, as if it were alive, fighting against the force they were trying to unleash. The fog seemed to coalesce, swirling violently, and Evelyn could feel the temperature drop even further, her breath coming in sharp gasps. With a decisive motion, Drake poured the ashes into the crack, and the change was immediate. The stone seemed to shudder, the symbols glowing with an eerie, ghostly light. The earth around them rumbled, as though the very core of the world were being disturbed. The crack in the stone widened, and something began to stir within it. A shape, dark and formless, began to push against the stone as if it were breaking free of its prison. The monument groaned, its voice no longer a whisper, but a deafening roar that filled the clearing. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest as she watched in horror. Something ancient, something beyond comprehension, was fighting to be free. She could feel it. This was what had been calling to them all along. The cold, the whispers, the dread, it was all leading up to this moment. But it wasn't just a feeling anymore. It was a presence, tangible and hungry. Whatever this entity was, it wasn't meant to be released. "No!" Drake shouted, his voice barely audible over the deafening roar. "It's too much. We've awakened something far worse than we ever imagined." The stone cracked open violently, shards of ancient rock flying outward, and the creature inside began to emerge. A twisted form of shadow and light, its shape constantly shifting, undulating like a wave of darkness. It was massive, a grotesque amalgamation of things both human and monstrous, its eyes glowing with an unearthly light. Evelyn stepped back in horror, but there was nowhere to run. The presence of the creature seemed to flood the clearing, suffocating them with its raw, malevolent power. She could feel it pulling at her very soul, a tugging sensation that threatened to drag her into the abyss. The wailing voice, now the creature's voice, echoed through the clearing. "You should have never come," it whispered, its voice like ice scraping against bone. "Now, you will join the others." In that moment, Evelyn understood the true horror of White Hollow. It wasn't just the town that had been cursed, it was the land itself. The creature was a part of it, and its hunger was insatiable. This was no simple haunting. This was the embodiment of the curse, of something ancient and primal that had been sleeping beneath their feet, waiting for someone foolish enough to wake it. Drake stumbled backward, his face pale, his eyes wide with terror. "We need to stop it. We need to finish what we started." His voice cracked with desperation, but Evelyn knew there was no easy way out of this. They had unleashed something far beyond their understanding, and now it was up to them to either destroy it or become another forgotten soul in the cursed town of White Hollow. The world seemed to collapse in on itself as the creature tore free from the stone, its shape shifting and contorting like a nightmare made flesh. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest as the air grew thick with the smell of decay, a scent so foul it made her stomach churn. The creature's eyes, glowing with an unnatural fire, locked onto her with an intensity that froze her in place. It knew who she was, what she had come for, and it was not going to let her escape. Drake, too, seemed paralyzed, his feet planted firmly in the snow, unable to look away from the writhing mass of darkness that was emerging from the shattered stone. The once serene, snow-covered forest had become a chaotic battleground, the very earth beneath them now hostile, groaning with the weight of the entity that had been imprisoned for centuries. As the creature stretched its monstrous limbs into the cold air, the wind began to howl, a cruel, mournful sound that seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 souls. "We've made a terrible mistake," Evelyn whispered, more to herself than to Drake. She could feel the creature's power pressing in on her, suffocating her, threatening to tear her apart from the inside. It was not just a being of darkness. It was a force of nature, an embodiment of something primal that had been lying in wait for centuries, bound to the land itself. The creature's voice echoed in her mind, cold and malevolent. "You should not have come here, Evelyn. You do not know what you have unleashed. You are nothing but a speck, a fleeting moment in the span of time. I have waited for so long, and now you will pay the price for your arrogance." Evelyn could feel her knees weaken beneath her, the weight of the creature's presence almost too much to bear. It was as if the very ground she stood on had turned against her, its power lashing out with every passing second. But amidst the overwhelming fear, there was a spark of something else, something deep within her. She had come here to stop the creature, to free the town from its grip, and though it seemed impossible now, she knew she couldn't give up. Not now. She turned to Drake, whose face had gone pale, his mouth moving soundlessly as if he were trying to form words but unable to speak. Evelyn gripped his arm, her fingers digging into his flesh, forcing him to look at her. "We have to finish this," she said, her voice steady despite the panic that roiled within her. "We can't let it win. We came here to destroy it. We're not leaving without doing that." Drake's eyes flickered with a moment of clarity, and he nodded slowly. "But how? It's too strong. We don't have the power to fight it. It's not just a thing. It's an ancient force. A curse. How do we stop something that's been here for centuries?" Evelyn didn't have an answer, but she could feel the weight of the vial of ashes still clutched in her hand, a reminder of what they had tried. It had only made the creature stronger, had only made it break free. But maybe there was something else, something they hadn't thought of, something tied to the very fabric of the land, to White Hollow's curse itself. As she stood there, her mind racing, the creature's body seemed to twist and pulse with unnatural life. It was almost as if it were feeding on their fear, growing stronger with each moment. The shadows around it deepened, spreading like ink across the snow, blotting out the sunlight and turning the forest into a claustrophobic void. Its voice, a low growl now, rumbled from its depths. "You cannot destroy me. I am the land. I am the curse. There is nothing you can do to stop me." Evelyn's breath came in ragged gasps as she felt the force of the creature's words, each one striking her like a blow to the chest. It was right. How could they destroy something so deeply ingrained in the land itself? The curse wasn't just a supernatural entity. It was a part of the town, part of the land that had suffered for so long. The creature, the wailing voice, the darkness. It had all been waiting for someone to come and break the seal, to release it from its prison. But Evelyn wasn't ready to give up. She remembered the stories, the whispers of the old town legends. The key to defeating the curse was not in sheer strength or brute force. It was in understanding the source of its power. The creature was bound to the land, yes, but that also meant it had a weakness, a tether that could be severed. "Drake," she said, her voice steady, "we need to find the heart of the curse. There's a way. It's hidden somewhere in this town. I don't know where, but we have to find it. We can't defeat this thing by fighting it head on. We need to destroy what holds it here, what binds it to White Hollow." Drake's eyes widened as the words clicked in his mind. The heart, the old church, the one that was burned down. It's always been a part of the stories, the rumors about the curse. Evelyn nodded. The church, of course. It wasn't just the place of worship. It was the focal point, the anchor to the land where the curse had first taken root. The creature's power had seeped into the town through that very structure, and though it had burned to the ground long ago, its remnants, its essence, were still tied to the land. If they could find the heart of the church's remains, they might be able to sever the connection, to destroy the curse once and for all. The ground beneath them trembled again, more violently this time, and the creature's laughter filled the clearing. "You will never make it to the heart. It is beyond your reach. You are too late." But Evelyn didn't listen to the creature's mocking voice. She turned to Drake, her resolve hardening. "We don't have much time. We have to go now." Together, they began to move, but the path ahead was shrouded in darkness, the fog growing thicker, the air colder. The creature's voice followed them, echoing through the trees, a constant reminder of the price they might pay. But Evelyn knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about ending the curse, putting an end to the horror that had plagued White Hollow for so long. And even though they were walking straight into the heart of the darkness, she refused to let the creature win. As Evelyn and Drake navigated through the dense forest, the weight of their decision pressed heavily on them. The creature's menacing laughter echoed in the distance, reverberating through the trees like a cold wind, as though it were not just a sound, but a force designed to strip them of their resolve. The snow, which had been a comforting constant since their arrival, now seemed to conspire against them, turning slick and treacherous beneath their boots, and the temperature dropped to an unbearable chill, numbing their fingers and toes. Evelyn's breath formed visible clouds in the icy air, and she could feel the weight of their quest bearing down on her. They had left the clearing where the creature had broken free, but the forest was no safer. The curse had seeped into the land, corrupting it in ways that made every step feel like a risk. The trees, once tall and proud, now bent unnaturally toward them, their branches twisted in grotesque, almost malicious shapes, as if reaching out to grab them and pull them into the darkness. Evelyn could almost feel the land itself pulsing with an ancient malevolence, an invisible pressure that squeezed the air from her lungs. Despite the ominous atmosphere, Evelyn knew they had no choice but to press forward. Her mind kept drifting back to the church, the remnants of it, buried beneath the snow and the years. The church was the heart of this curse. That was the key. If they could reach it, find the core of its power, perhaps, just perhaps, they could sever the link the creature had to this land and end its reign of terror. But the creature's words lingered in her mind, whispering to her that they were too late, that the heart was beyond their reach. What did that mean? And why did she feel as though the very earth itself was conspiring against them? Drake stumbled beside her, his face drawn and pale. "We're close, right?" he asked, his voice strained. "You're sure it's the church? That's the place we need to go." Evelyn nodded, though doubt gnawed at her as well. She had only heard stories, old stories, whispered by townsfolk who dared not speak of the curse, or of the church that had stood as a symbol of the town's fleeting hope. The church was not just a building. It was the origin of all that had gone wrong. It had been abandoned long ago after a series of unexplained fires and tragic events, but rumors of its haunting presence had never truly faded. It was a place of power, one that should have been destroyed, but now, after all these years, it might just hold the key to ending everything. The snowstorm picked up, howling through the trees with an intensity that drowned out all other sounds. Visibility became almost non-existent. Evelyn's eyes strained through the blizzard, searching for any sign of the old church, the place that would either be their salvation or their doom. The air felt thick, suffocating, as if it were charged with static, and the earth beneath them seemed to shudder with each gust of wind. The creature, though miles away, still loomed in their minds, a constant reminder of the danger they faced. But it was when they reached the clearing, just beyond the thick line of trees, that something shifted in the atmosphere. The wind stopped abruptly, and the oppressive weight that had followed them seemed to dissipate, replaced by an eerie stillness that was almost worse than the storm itself. The ground before them was barren, the snow churned and disturbed, as though something had recently been here. Evelyn's heart skipped a beat as her gaze fell upon the ruins ahead. They had found it. The remnants of the church lay before them, half buried beneath the snow, its skeletal frame a ghostly silhouette against the darkened sky. The remains of the once majestic structure were now a decaying husk, its walls crumbling and broken, its steeple long since fallen. But there, nestled between the fractured stones and half-destroyed pews, was something that made Evelyn's blood run cold. A faint, flickering light, as though something was alive within the heart of the ruin. "This is it," she breathed, her voice barely a whisper. "The heart of the curse. We found it." Drake was silent beside her, his face tight with a mixture of fear and awe. He looked at the ruins, his eyes wide as he seemed to grapple with the enormity of what they were about to face. "I don't know if I can do this," he admitted. "I'm scared, Evelyn. We're talking about something ancient, something we don't understand. What if we fail?" Evelyn placed a hand on his shoulder, her fingers cold but steady. "We have no choice. This is the only way. We either stop it here, or the creature wins. We can't let it take over everything. The town, the people, the land, it all depends on what happens here." With a deep breath, they stepped forward into the church's ruins, the faint light growing brighter with each step. The air inside was damp, heavy with the scent of old wood and decay. The walls, though battered and broken, still carried an aura of unease, a residue of the power that had once radiated from this place. The temperature dropped even further, and Evelyn could see her breath fogging in front of her as she moved deeper into the church. At the very center of the ruin stood a stone pedestal, its surface etched with ancient symbols, worn but still visible. The light emanated from the cracks in the stone, as if it were coming from deep within the earth itself. Evelyn's pulse quickened, and she realized, with a cold shiver down her spine, that this wasn't just a place of worship. It was a place of sacrifice, a place where the curse had been bound. She approached the pedestal cautiously, her fingers trembling as she reached out to touch the stone. The moment her hand made contact, the light flared brightly, blinding her for a moment. The ground beneath her shook violently, as if the very core of the earth had been disturbed. A deep, guttural roar filled the air, and the walls of the church began to crack, the stone trembling under the force of something awakening. Drake grabbed her arm, pulling her back just as the pedestal shattered, sending a shockwave through the ruins. The light grew blinding, and the temperature plunged to an unbearable low. Something was emerging from the stone, something ancient, something far more powerful than the creature they had already unleashed. It was at that moment that Evelyn realized there was no end to the curse. What they had come to destroy was not the creature itself, but the very foundation of the evil that had taken root in White Hollow. The heart of the curse was not a physical object. It was the land itself, and they had just broken its final seal. The violent tremor that had rocked the ruins of the church left Evelyn and Drake momentarily disoriented. The ground beneath their feet seemed to churn, as if the earth itself were awakening from a long slumber. As they steadied themselves, the light from the shattered pedestal pulsated, casting erratic shadows that twisted and writhed on the cracked walls. The air was thick with an unnatural cold, and the eerie howls of wind outside were now replaced by something darker, something that seemed to originate from deep within the church itself. Evelyn's heart raced, her breath shallow. What had they done? She could feel the energy in the air growing heavier, more oppressive. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The pedestal had not been a mere symbol of the curse. It was its anchor. The power they had unleashed by touching it had fractured the very barrier that had contained the malevolent force for centuries. The creature that had hunted them through the town, the entity that had taunted them from the shadows, was only one part of something much older, much more dangerous. The pedestal had been holding the true evil in check, and now it was free. Drake stood beside her, his face pale, his expression a mix of confusion and fear. "What do we do now?" he asked, his voice trembling. "This isn't what we expected. We were supposed to destroy it, not set it free." Evelyn turned to him, her eyes wide with panic, but also a creeping understanding. I don't know, but I think we've just triggered something far worse than we imagined." She swallowed hard, trying to steady herself. This curse isn't just about the creature. It's about something older, something tied to the land itself. If we don't stop it now, it could spread beyond White Hollow. The flickering light grew even brighter, and Evelyn instinctively stepped back. Her feet felt heavy, as though the ground itself was pulling at her, trying to draw her into the earth. Her mind raced. There had to be a way to fix this, some way to undo the damage they had done. But the realization that the curse wasn't just localized to the town, that it was embedded in the land itself, left her with a sinking feeling in her stomach. The town had been a mere symptom. The real disease was much deeper. The air in the church was growing thicker, the temperature plunging further as the light continued to pulse ominously. In the shadows, movement caught Evelyn's eye, a figure, tall and dark, slithering in and out of view. The creature had found them, or perhaps it had been there all along, waiting for the right moment to strike. Evelyn's pulse quickened as she tried to focus on the figure, but every time she thought she had seen it, it would vanish into the darkness again. The church seemed to be shifting, its dimensions warping, as if the very fabric of reality were tearing apart. "We need to get out of here," Drake said urgently, his voice hoarse with panic. "This place is falling apart. We have to leave before it's too late." Evelyn hesitated, her eyes flicking to the broken pedestal. What had it all been for? She had come to the church in search of answers, seeking a way to destroy the creature and end the curse. But now she was more uncertain than ever. It felt as though the answers she sought were slipping through her fingers, slipping into the cracks of the ground, swallowed by the very land she was trying to save. But leaving wasn't an option. They were already too deep in, The curse had already claimed the land, and no matter how much they ran, it would follow them. They could feel it now, the weight of the curse seeping into their bones. It had always been there, lurking beneath the surface of White Hollow, and they had unwittingly given it permission to surface. There was no escape, not unless they could find the source of the curse and destroy it once and for all. Evelyn's gaze shifted to the wreckage around them, her mind scrambling for a plan. The symbols etched into the stone of the church were not just decorative. They were part of the seal, part of what had held the curse at bay. She felt a sudden spark of clarity. If she could decipher these markings, if she could find the key to the ritual that had been performed here all those years ago, maybe, just maybe, she could reverse the damage. But time was running out. The ground was trembling more violently now, and the air felt as though it were closing in on them. Drake's voice snapped her back to the present. "Evelyn, look." He pointed toward the back of the church, where the walls seemed to be folding in on themselves, revealing a hidden passage. The flickering light emanated from within, growing even more intense. The temperature dropped even further, and the wind picked up again, howling through the church's crumbling frame. The passage beckoned, promising answers, or perhaps more dangers. Without a word, Evelyn took a step toward the passage. There was no choice now. They had no way of knowing what lay beyond that darkened corridor, but staying here, surrounded by the oppressive energy of the curse, was not an option. She felt the pull of the darkness, the unseen force that urged her forward, compelling her to take the next step, even if it meant walking straight into the unknown. As she crossed the threshold of the hidden passage, the world seemed to shift once more. The walls groaned and creaked as if they were alive, the stone vibrating beneath her feet. The air inside was thick with the scent of old incense, and the temperature plummeted to an unbearable low. She could feel the presence of something ancient, something that had been buried here for centuries, rising slowly just behind them, closing in. Evelyn didn't look back. She couldn't afford to. If they were to survive, they needed to find the source, to undo the curse before it could consume everything. It was their only hope, and in that moment, as the passage seemed to stretch out before her, she realized something crucial. This was no longer just about saving White Hollow. This was about saving herself, and possibly the entire world, from something far worse than they had ever imagined. As Evelyn and Drake ventured deeper into the hidden passage, the oppressive cold that had haunted them in the church seemed to intensify. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth, and every step they took felt as though it were echoing through the very bones of the town. The flickering light that had beckoned them forward grew dimmer, but still, it urged them on, guiding their every move. Evelyn's breath was ragged, her body shivering not just from the cold, but from a growing sense of dread that seemed to settle deeper in her chest with each passing moment. The passage was narrow, the walls pressed close against them as they trudged onward in silence. Every now and then, Evelyn would catch glimpses of strange markings carved into the stone, symbols that seemed to twist and shift as if they were alive, watching them. She couldn't help but feel that they were being led down a path that was not their own. The feeling was suffocating, as though something was waiting just beyond the corner of her vision, something ancient and malevolent that had been watching them from the shadows. Drake, walking slightly ahead of her, glanced over his shoulder with a look of concern. "Evelyn, what's going on?" he asked softly. "This doesn't feel right. This whole place, it's like it's alive, breathing." Evelyn could barely bring herself to answer. She had no clear explanation, no comfort to offer him. She only knew that whatever had been unleashed in the church was now tracking them, drawn to the energy they had disturbed. It was as if the walls themselves were shifting, watching their every move. It was becoming harder to distinguish what was real and what was a product of their fear. The deeper they went, the more the line between the physical and the supernatural blurred. The corridor seemed to stretch endlessly before them, its darkness swallowing them whole. The light flickered, casting long, twisted shadows on the walls. Evelyn felt a sudden impulse to turn back, to run back to the safety of the outside world. But something held her in place, an invisible force that pressed down on her shoulders, urging her onward. She couldn't explain why, but she knew they had to keep moving. They had to reach the source of whatever dark power had been awakened. As they rounded a bend in the passage, the flickering light ahead intensified, revealing a massive door at the end. It was ancient, made of weathered wood and iron, with intricate carvings that seemed to pulse with a faint glow. The carvings were unlike any she had ever seen, symbols and patterns that seemed familiar, yet foreign. Evelyn felt a sickening realization wash over her. These were the same symbols she had seen etched into the walls of the church, the same ones that had appeared in the town's history, hidden within the old texts she had unearthed. This door was the final barrier, the last line of defense against whatever lay on the other side. Drake stopped beside her, his voice low but urgent. "Do you think it's safe to open it?" Evelyn's eyes were fixed on the door, her mind racing. There was no choice. They had come this far, and the only way to end the curse was to face whatever lay behind it. "We don't have a choice," she said quietly, her voice steady but strained. "We have to open it. We've disturbed something ancient, something tied to the very land itself. If we don't stop it now, it'll consume everything. This town, the people, us." Taking a deep breath, Evelyn reached for the door, her hand trembling as she gripped the cold, rusted handle. The air around them seemed to grow heavier, as if the entire passage were holding its breath, waiting. With a sharp pull, the door groaned and creaked, opening with a slow, eerie motion. As it swung wide, an overwhelming rush of energy surged out from the darkened room beyond, hitting them like a wall of ice-cold wind. Inside, the room was vast and dimly lit, illuminated only by the faint glow of the carvings etched into the walls. The space was circular, and at its center stood a stone altar, ancient and worn, with a large, blood-red gemstone embedded in its center. It pulsed with an eerie light, the glow shifting between shades of crimson and violet. Evelyn's heart raced as she stepped forward, unable to tear her eyes away from the gem. It was the source, the power that had been unleashed when they had disturbed the pedestal in the church. It had all led them here. "What is this place?" Drake whispered, his voice barely audible. Evelyn's throat tightened, and for the first time, she realized just how little she understood. She had thought the curse was simply a local haunting, a malevolent presence that preyed on the town. But now she saw the truth. This was a nexus of power, something that had existed long before White Hollow had been settled, and long before she or Drake had ever set foot in the town. This was not just a curse, it was an ancient ritual, a binding force that had tied the land and the people to something far darker. The gemstone in the altar was not just a source of power. It was a key to an ancient world that had been sealed away for a reason. Evelyn felt a creeping sensation at the back of her mind, a whisper in the dark that urged her closer. She knew, without a doubt, that touching it would release something unimaginable. It wasn't just the curse they had unleashed. It was the creature, the entity that had haunted them, and it was more than they had ever imagined. As she stepped forward, her hand reaching for the stone, a sudden thought struck her. What if this was all part of a cycle? What if the creature was not just trying to break free, but trying to finish something that had begun long before White Hollow was ever built? The question lingered in her mind as she hesitated, staring at the gemstone. This was the point of no return, and the weight of that realization hung heavy in the air. Before she could act, a low growl filled the room, and the walls seemed to close in, as if the very earth was rejecting them. Evelyn and Drake froze in place, their hearts racing. The presence was closing in around them, the creature they had been running from finally cornering them. But Evelyn knew one thing. There was no turning back now. Whatever happened next would shape the fate of White Hollow, and perhaps the world itself. The question was, who would survive to see the end? The air in the room seemed to thicken as the low growl reverberated through the stone walls, an ominous sound that seemed to come from all directions. Evelyn's pulse quickened, her fingers just inches away from the glowing gemstone at the altar's center. Every instinct screamed at her to pull away, to run, but there was no time. The moment the stone had been disturbed, the ancient power beneath the town had stirred, waking something that should have remained hidden for eternity. Now, As if sensing its moment of resurgence, it was pulling them into its web, drawing them toward its endless hunger. Drake's voice, barely a whisper, trembled beside her. "Evelyn, what is that sound? What's happening?" Evelyn couldn't answer. She could barely breathe, let alone explain the enormity of what they had uncovered. The growl was getting louder, closer. Something was moving within the dark recesses of the room, something that defied logic, that existed beyond the understanding of human perception. The creature, the entity they had inadvertently awakened, was no longer confined to the shadows. It was alive, and it was hungry. With an effort, Evelyn tore her gaze from the gemstone and turned toward the room's edges, where the shadows seemed to pulse and shift in unnatural ways. The faint light of the altar barely illuminated the walls, but she could feel the presence of something ancient and powerful growing stronger with every second. The walls felt like they were closing in, and Evelyn's heart raced as she realized that the passages they had traversed to get here were no longer just dark corridors. They were the veins of a living organism, a dark creature that had been feeding off the town for centuries. The symbols on the walls shifted again, their intricate patterns warping into grotesque shapes, as if the very air around them was being warped by the creature's presence. Evelyn glanced at Drake, who had taken a step back, his eyes wide with terror. But there was no escape. Every route, every possible exit, was now blocked by the invisible force that had been waiting for this moment. They were trapped, and the only way out was through the heart of the nightmare that surrounded them. "What do we do?" Drake asked, his voice hoarse with fear. Evelyn swallowed hard, her mind spinning. She had always believed that knowledge was the key to understanding, to defeating whatever dark force had taken hold of White Hollow. But now, standing on the precipice of the unknown, she realized how little she truly knew. She had always assumed that the curse was merely a ghost, a lingering spirit trapped between worlds. But this was something far older, far darker. The curse wasn't a lingering soul. It was a living, breathing entity that had existed before the first settlers arrived. The whispers from the shadows grew louder, now clearly discernible as a guttural, almost human-like voice. "You should not have come," it hissed, the words echoing in Evelyn's mind like a disease. "You have awakened the Old One." Evelyn's stomach turned as the realization hit her. The Old One, the entity tied to the town, to the land itself, was not a mere supernatural presence. It was a godlike being, ancient and unknowable, whose very existence had been the source of the town's curse. The stone, the symbols, the rituals, they were all part of an effort to bind it, to keep it at bay. But now that it had been awakened, there was no turning back. The curse was merely a veil, a thin layer of protection to keep the creature from breaking free. Drake staggered backward, his face pale. "We can't stop it. It's too powerful." "No," Evelyn breathed, her voice barely a whisper. "We can stop it. There has to be a way." But as soon as the words left her mouth, a heavy, crushing weight descended upon her chest, pressing down on her, making it hard to breathe. She gasped for air, her vision blurring as the room around her began to shift, warping in ways that defied reality. The light from the altar flickered, and then went out completely, plunging them into darkness. A cold, suffocating darkness that seemed to choke the life from everything it touched. In the suffocating silence, a sudden shift occurred. Evelyn's senses became heightened, her vision sharpening, and for a brief moment, she thought she saw the creature. It was massive, its form nearly impossible to comprehend. It was an amalgamation of darkness and shadow, a towering figure with glowing red eyes that glinted like fire. It was not bound by the laws of physics or reason. It existed outside of time and space. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if the creature was communicating directly with her mind, forcing itself into her thoughts. "You are mine," the voice rumbled, an almost intimate whisper. "You will free me." Evelyn's mind reeled. The creature didn't just want to escape. It wanted to be freed, to be unleashed upon the world. It wanted to reclaim what had been taken from it long ago. White Hollow and the lives it had consumed were nothing but sacrifices in the greater scheme of things. The creature was not just tied to the land. It was the land. It was the earth beneath their feet, the trees, the very air they breathed. It had always been here, lurking, waiting for the right moment to emerge. Evelyn closed her eyes, focusing on her breathing. She couldn't let fear take over. She couldn't allow the creature to control her. The town's history was buried in layers of lies, of half-forgotten rituals meant to contain the entity. But perhaps there was something they had missed, some clue in the church, in the symbols, in the very ground they stood on. She couldn't rely on the knowledge she had gathered over the years. She had to think differently. The old one didn't work by human logic. It thrived on manipulation, on bending reality to its will. Drake's voice broke through her thoughts. "Evelyn, we need to do something. Now." Evelyn snapped her eyes open, her mind made up. She stepped toward the altar, her hand shaking but resolute. She couldn't let the creature break free. Not like this. Not now. But as her fingers hovered just above the stone, a new voice, soft, quiet, almost familiar, whispered in her ear. "Destroy it. Destroy it all." The words, like a knife to the heart, sent a shiver of realization through Evelyn. This was the only way to end it. The creature's power, the curse, the rituals, it all had to be undone. There could be no leaving White Hollow as it was. There could be no victory without sacrifice. With a deep breath, Evelyn made her decision. She slammed her palm onto the gemstone, a wave of heat surging through her body as the room filled with a blinding light. The stone cracked, and the world around them trembled. Whatever happened next, she knew would change everything. The silence that followed the crack of the gemstone was absolute. Time seemed to stretch, bending under the weight of Evelyn's decision. The room pulsed with energy, the stone at the altar shattering with a sound like thunder. And for a brief moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The glowing fragments scattered in all directions, disappearing into the shadows of the ancient chamber. But the absence of the gemstone didn't bring peace. On the contrary, it ushered in something far darker. The air, thick with a stifling cold, trembled as though something had shifted on an elemental level. The very ground beneath their feet seemed to hum with the force of an awakening that was neither natural nor welcome. Drake, wide-eyed and breathless, backed away from the altar. "What have you done?" he whispered, fear and disbelief tainting his voice. His gaze was fixed on the empty space where the stone had once rested, now filled only with the remnants of its shattered form. Evelyn didn't respond immediately. Her mind was consumed with the moment, with the overwhelming sensation that the fabric of reality itself had been torn. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach, the creeping sensation that something had shifted irrevocably. The whispers, once distant and quiet, now echoed in her mind like 1,000 voices speaking in unison, a cacophony of hunger and rage. The temperature in the room dropped further. Frost began to form on the edges of the walls, creeping along the ceiling like the tendrils of a living thing. It was as if the creature, the ancient entity that had slumbered beneath White Hollow for centuries, had taken its first breath of freedom. But the liberation wasn't without consequence. The very air seemed charged, heavy with the weight of something vast and terrifying that was now waking up from its long imprisonment. "We've unleashed it," Evelyn said, her voice thick with realization. "We've broken the seal." Drake was shaking now, his face pale and his movements erratic. "But you were the one who thought we could stop it. You said we could end it." His words were bitter, full of accusation, but Evelyn could only stare at the place where the gemstone had been. There was no turning back now. There was no undoing what had been set in motion. The ground shook beneath them, a low rumble that echoed through the chamber like a beast stirring in its sleep. And then, from the darkness at the far end of the room, something moved. A shadow, an indistinct shape, but it was large, unnaturally so. It seemed to bend the very light around it, its form flickering and shifting like a mirage. The whispers grew louder, their language indecipherable, but filled with an undeniable sense of urgency. It was as if the creature was summoning them, drawing them into its grasp. "Get back! Evelyn shouted, stepping in front of Drake. Her voice was sharp with panic, but there was little she could do. The thing that was coming was not something that could be fought with mere words or weapons. It was an ancient force, a primal entity that existed beyond human comprehension. The cold, the darkness, the shadows, they were all part of it. And now it was free. The curse was no longer something bound to the land. It was alive, and it had its sights set on them. The room seemed to constrict around them, the walls closing in, pressing in from all sides. The air was thick with a biting chill, and Evelyn could feel the very life being drained from her body with each passing second. The whispers were no longer just in her head. They were all around them, filling the space, pressing in from all angles. A cold, clammy sweat formed on her brow as she realized that the creature was not only attempting to reclaim its power, it was feeding off their fear. The more terrified they were, the stronger it became. Drake took a tentative step back, his eyes fixed on the flickering shape that loomed in the darkness. "What is it? What is that thing?" His voice was hoarse, strained with fear, but Evelyn could hear the question in his tone. He wasn't just asking what the creature was, he was asking how they could survive it. Evelyn's heart raced. She had no answers. There was no script to follow here. All she could do was act, to try and make sense of the madness that had overtaken them. Her fingers tightened around the remnants of the gemstone that lay at her feet, a jagged shard that was still glowing faintly, almost as if it were alive. It was then that she understood. The gemstone had been the key, not just to the creature's binding, but to its release. The ritual wasn't a binding at all. It had been a prison, a trap designed to contain the entity's power, to keep it dormant. But the moment they shattered the stone, they had broken the last barrier. The entity was no longer trapped within the earth. It was free to move, to grow, to reclaim its lost power. "Drake," Evelyn said, her voice trembling but steady. "We have to find the others. We have to stop it. There's no time left." But Drake's gaze was locked on the shifting darkness. His eyes were wide with terror, but there was something else there too, something that Evelyn couldn't place. It wasn't just fear. It was something deeper, something that made her heart skip a beat, as if the creature's presence was already reaching into him, altering him in ways she couldn't comprehend. "Drake?" she asked, but it was too late. He was already stepping toward the darkness, drawn in by an invisible force. Evelyn reached out, but her fingers brushed against nothing. The space between them seemed to stretch, like an invisible wall had formed between them. She could hear Drake's voice, but it wasn't the same. It was distant, as though he was already beyond her reach. "No," Evelyn whispered, her mind racing. "No, not you too." The room seemed to hold its breath once again, as if waiting for the inevitable. The creature, now fully awakened, was taking form in front of her. And just like that, she realized that the town of White Hollow, the town she had believed she could save, was already lost. The battle had already been decided. The question was no longer whether they could stop the entity. The question was whether they could survive long enough to understand the true cost of their actions. Evelyn stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest as Drake, lost to the dark influence, moved deeper into the shadowy abyss that now consumed the room. His eyes were vacant, glazed over, and there was a strange, unnatural calm in his movements. The room around her continued to pulse, the very air thick with an oppressive energy, as if the walls themselves were alive, watching her. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but she couldn't tear her eyes away from the nightmare unfolding before her. She tried to move toward him, to pull him back, but each step was like wading through a thick fog, the very space around her growing heavier with each breath she took. The whispers in her mind were louder now, more insistent, their language incomprehensible, but filled with a sinister intent. She could feel their cold fingers creeping into her thoughts, sowing seeds of doubt and fear, trying to tear away her resolve. Drake's voice, once full of terror, was now eerily calm. "It's too late, Evelyn. There's no going back. We're already part of it. We always have been." His words echoed in the room, their meaning settling into Evelyn's bones like a truth she couldn't escape. Her hand trembled as she reached for the shard of the gemstone at her feet, its faint glow offering no comfort, only a reminder of the power she had unleashed. She had been so focused on the idea of breaking the curse, of stopping the ancient evil that had plagued White Hollow for centuries, that she had never truly understood the depths of what she was dealing with. The creature, the entity that had slumbered beneath the town, was not just a force of destruction. It was a force of manipulation, of control. It didn't need to destroy everything. It needed to bend everything to its will. And it had already begun with Drake. Evelyn's heart clenched with guilt and regret. Had she made a terrible mistake in thinking she could undo what had been done? Drake took another step toward the darkness. The space between them seemed to stretch impossibly further, his figure growing more indistinct, as if he were being swallowed whole by the shadows. "Come with me, Evelyn," he said, his voice barely a whisper now. "You don't have to fight it. You don't have to run anymore. It's over." The words hung in the air, tempting, promising an end to the chaos. But Evelyn knew better. This wasn't freedom. This wasn't peace. It was an illusion, a lie crafted by the creature to lure her into its grasp. She couldn't give in. She couldn't become another pawn in its twisted game. But as she stood there, feeling the weight of the darkness press in around her, doubt crept into her mind. Was there another way? Was there still hope? Or had she truly doomed them all? The gemstone shard she held in her hand pulsed faintly, as if it were calling to her. Perhaps, just perhaps, there was a way to turn the tide. If she could only understand the true nature of the creature's power, if she could learn to control it rather than be controlled by it. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden tremor in the ground, a violent shaking that threw her off balance. The shadows in the room seemed to grow longer, more twisted, as if they were reaching toward her, pulling her in. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat as the air grew colder still, her lungs burning with each inhalation. The whispers grew louder, now filling her ears, drowning out all other sound. She could no longer distinguish between the whispers of the creature and the voice of her own mind. It was as if they had become one. In the distance, a figure appeared, a tall silhouette that seemed to materialize from the darkness. It was a man, or something resembling one, but his face was hidden beneath the hood of a tattered cloak. His eyes, when they met Evelyn's, were an unnatural shade of black, void-like, as though they contained the depths of an endless abyss. He moved toward her with purpose, his steps slow but deliberate. "Evelyn," the figure said, his voice smooth but cold, carrying an authority that sent a chill down her spine. "You have made a grave mistake, but there is still time to make things right." His words were both a warning and a promise. Evelyn couldn't discern whether this man was an ally or another instrument of the creature's will. But she knew one thing for certain. He was not someone to be trusted easily. "You have to stop this," Evelyn said, her voice shaking with a mixture of fear and determination. "You have to help me undo it. I don't care what it takes. Please help me." The figure did not respond immediately. Instead, he studied her, his gaze penetrating, as though he were trying to see into her very soul. "Undo it," he repeated, a faint, humorless smile curving his lips. "You cannot undo what has already been done. The thread has been severed, and now we must face the consequences." His words hit her like a slap to the face. The reality of their situation settled on her like a heavy shroud. There was no going back. She had already shattered the seal that bound the creature. The darkness that loomed over White Hollow wasn't just a curse. It was a part of the town's very fabric, and it wasn't going to let them go. The man took a step closer, his presence overwhelming. "You think you can fight it? That you can stop what's coming? You've only just begun to understand the true cost of your actions." Evelyn felt a surge of panic as his words struck at her heart. Was it true? Had they really gone too far? The town, the people, they were all at the mercy of whatever lay ahead. She had no answers, no way of stopping the flood of destruction that was certain to follow. But she had to try. She had to find a way to turn the tide. She couldn't let the creature win. The man's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, there was a flicker of something in them. Something dark, something ancient. "You'll understand soon enough. The creature has been waiting, and now it has you." As he spoke, the shadows around them thickened, closing in on all sides, pressing in on her. Evelyn's heart raced, the weight of their predicament heavier than ever. There was no escape from this darkness, no way to outrun the inevitable. But even as the room seemed to swallow her whole, one thought burned in her mind. She wasn't finished yet. Not if she could help it, but in the face of such overwhelming odds, the question remained. Could she truly stop the creature, or was she already too far gone, lost in the darkness forever? As the shadows closed in around Evelyn, she felt as though the very air had turned to ice. The man, whoever he was, stood before her, his eyes filled with a knowing darkness that seemed to pulse with the power of the creature that had haunted White Hollow for so long. She had reached the final threshold, the point of no return, and yet she couldn't afford to stop now. There had to be something she could do. She had to find a way to fight back. The creature had been patient, waiting for centuries to awaken, and now it was closer than ever to consuming everything. It had already begun its conquest through Drake, using him as a vessel, a conduit to spread its influence. Evelyn's heart ached at the thought of her friend, lost to the darkness, but she couldn't afford to dwell on that now. She had to focus on the creature, on the heart of the evil that had rooted itself in White Hollow. The figure before her, this mysterious man, watched her carefully, as though measuring her every move. His presence was suffocating, a weight in the room that threatened to crush her resolve. "You can't stop this," he said again, his voice cold, unyielding. "You've already broken the seal. What's left is inevitable." Evelyn clenched her fists. His words, meant to break her, only steeled her determination. The creature's influence was strong, but she knew one thing: it thrived on fear. If she gave into it now, if she allowed herself to be consumed by the overwhelming sense of helplessness, she would lose, and the creature would win. "Then why are you here?" she asked, her voice unwavering despite the fear that clawed at her insides. "If it's already over, why do you want to help me?" The figure paused, as if considering her question. His eyes flickered with something, a brief hesitation that was almost imperceptible. "I'm not here to help you," he said slowly. "I am here to remind you of the truth. The truth you've ignored in your desperate pursuit of salvation." Evelyn swallowed hard. "What truth?" she demanded, stepping forward. The darkness around her seemed to recoil at her defiance, but she didn't back down. "What is it that you're hiding?" The man's lips twisted into a cruel smile, and he stepped toward her, his presence overwhelming. "You think you can undo what has been set in motion," he said softly. "But you've already made your choice. The curse wasn't something that could be simply lifted. It's part of this town, part of its very foundation. The bloodline that runs through the streets of White Hollow is tainted. It always has been." Evelyn felt her stomach churn at his words. It wasn't just the creature that had been waiting. It was the entire town, the entire history of White Hollow that was entangled with the darkness. This wasn't just a battle for survival. It was a battle for the soul of the town itself. The creature had always been a part of them, feeding on the fear, the pain, the suffering that had been buried beneath the surface for generations. She had known that White Hollow held dark secrets, but she hadn't realized how deep those secrets ran. How much the people themselves were bound to the very evil they sought to destroy. And now, in her desperate quest to break the curse, she had become a part of it as well. The figure's voice dropped to a whisper. "You can fight all you want, Evelyn, but you will never escape what you are. It's in your blood. It's in your soul. And it will claim you, just as it has claimed all the others." Evelyn's heart raced, but she refused to let his words sink in. She had already come too far to turn back. She had to believe that there was a way out, that there was a chance to break the cycle, to free herself and Drake and the entire town from the creature's grasp. She took a step back, her eyes flicking to the shard of gemstone in her hand. It was still glowing, faintly, its light the only thing cutting through the overwhelming darkness. The stone had been her only hope since the beginning, the one thing that had given her the courage to keep going. But now, with the creature's power tightening its grip around her, she wasn't sure if the stone could truly help. And yet, a flicker of hope ignited within her. Perhaps it wasn't the stone itself, but the strength within her that could make the difference. The creature had sought to control her, to twist her mind and spirit, but it could never control her will. She wasn't just a vessel for it to manipulate. She was Evelyn, and she still had a choice. The figure watched her closely, his expression unreadable. "Do you still think you can fight it?" he asked, his voice low, almost pitying. "You're nothing against it." "Nothing." Evelyn shook her head. "No," she said, her voice firm, steady. "I'm not nothing. I'm not you. And I'm not giving up." The figure's smile faded, replaced by a look of mild surprise. For a moment, he seemed uncertain, as though her defiance had caught him off guard. Then, with a dismissive flick of his hand, he stepped back into the shadows, his figure fading into the darkness. But Evelyn wasn't looking at him anymore. Her focus was on the stone, on the power it contained. She wasn't sure what had changed, but she felt something shift within her, a surge of energy that didn't come from the creature or the stone, but from herself. She had been fighting for so long, driven by fear and desperation. But now, for the first time, she felt a strange calm. She understood. She couldn't fight the darkness by running from it or by trying to overpower it. She had to face it. She had to embrace it. The room trembled again, the ground beneath her feet shaking as the shadows writhed, as if the very walls of the building were alive, aware of what was happening. Evelyn stood tall, her eyes narrowing in determination. She would not let this be the end. She would face whatever came next, not as a pawn, but as a force of her own. The man's voice echoed one last time from the shadows. "You can't win. No one ever does." Evelyn didn't answer. She didn't need to. The truth was clear now. Whether she won or lost didn't matter. What mattered was that she had chosen to fight. And in that choice, she had already begun to change the game. The darkness roared around her, but Evelyn's resolve burned brighter than ever. The night had stretched on, endless and suffocating. The storm outside, which had once seemed like a mere backdrop to the town's impending doom, had now become a part of the very fabric of White Hollow. The winds howled, and snow whirled in thick, suffocating clouds, as if nature itself were conspiring against those who dared to confront the darkness that had rooted itself deep within the town. Evelyn stood at the center of it all, her heart racing, not from fear, but from a strange sense of clarity. The final moment had arrived, the culmination of everything she had fought for. The figure, the man who had tried to sway her, who had tried to break her, had disappeared into the shadows, but his words still lingered in the air like a poison. He had told her that she couldn't win, that no one ever had, but Evelyn had never been one to back down from a challenge. The creature, the very thing that had haunted White Hollow for centuries, was still lurking, waiting to consume everything. But Evelyn had something the creature could never possess: the strength of will to fight. It was in this very fight, this struggle for her soul, for the soul of the town, that Evelyn realized the truth. The creature didn't want to just consume her. It wanted to break her, make her give up, surrender to the darkness. But the more it tried to choke the life out of her, the more determined she became. The strength wasn't in her ability to fight it physically. It was in her refusal to give in, her refusal to let fear dictate her actions. Standing in the center of the town square, Evelyn felt the pulse of the creature beneath the ground, beneath the very air she breathed. She could feel its presence, not as a thing separate from her, but as something that was intertwined with her very being, with the town itself. White Hollow had always been a place steeped in secrets, in a history tainted by its past. The creature had fed on that history, on the pain and suffering of the generations that had passed. And now it was time to end it. With a deep breath, Evelyn held the gemstone in her hand, its light flickering weakly in the snowstorm. The stone had been her companion throughout this journey, but she knew now that it wasn't the stone that held the power, it was her. The gemstone had been a conduit, a reminder that she could fight, but it was her own strength, her will to survive, that had gotten her this far. She had become more than just a victim of the curse. She had become its challenger. She glanced around at the empty streets of White Hollow. The town was asleep, or so it seemed, but Evelyn knew better. The creature was stirring, aware that the end was near. She could sense it in the way the shadows moved, in the cold wind that cut through her skin like a blade. It was as though the very town was holding its breath, waiting for her next move. With a sudden burst of clarity, Evelyn began to speak, her voice carrying over the howling wind. "I will not be your vessel. I will not be your servant. I am not what you want me to be." Her words echoed through the silence, reverberating off the old buildings, finding their way into the very heart of the town. The ground beneath her feet trembled, a low growl vibrating from deep within the earth. The creature was reacting, enraged by her defiance. But Evelyn's voice grew stronger, more forceful, as though each word she spoke tore through the darkness that had once surrounded her. "You have no power over me. You cannot control me anymore." She could feel the energy around her, like a rising tide, as the creature recoiled. For the first time, it felt uncertain, threatened. Suddenly the air shifted. The storm seemed to pause, as if nature itself had stopped to watch. Evelyn's heart raced as the shadows around her began to twist, the darkness folding in on itself. The creature, in all its power, was pulling back. It had been feeding on fear, on hopelessness, and now it was losing its grip. Her defiance, her refusal to accept its dominion, was like a blade cutting through the thick fog of despair that had held White Hollow captive for so long. In that moment, Evelyn understood. The battle wasn't just between her and the creature. It was a battle for the town's soul. White Hollow had been built on lies, on secrets that had festered in the dark for far too long. But now, the truth was coming to light. The darkness couldn't survive in the light of truth. The very foundation of the town had been tainted, yes, but it could also be redeemed. The gemstone in her hand flared to life, its light intensifying until it burned like a beacon in the darkness. The creature screamed, a sound that seemed to shake the very sky, as though it were being torn apart by an unseen force. Evelyn closed her eyes, her hands raised toward the heavens, the stone glowing brighter with each passing second. She wasn't just calling on the stone's power now. She was calling on the strength that had always been within her, the power of her defiance, her refusal to let the darkness consume her. And then, with a deafening crash, the storm exploded. The winds howled with a fury that rattled the very bones of White Hollow, but Evelyn stood firm, unwavering. The creature's roar was drowned out by the light, by the intensity of her will. The shadows writhed, the darkness buckled, and with one final, earth-shaking tremor, the creature's hold on the town shattered. For a long moment, there was silence. Then, the snow stopped falling. The wind died down. The world seemed to exhale. Evelyn collapsed to her knees, the gemstone dimming in her hand as the last remnants of the creature's power vanished into the void. The storm had passed. The darkness had been defeated. But Evelyn knew that this victory had come at a cost. White Hollow had been freed, but it would never be the same. The town's history, its ghosts, had been exorcised. And in the stillness, she could almost hear the quiet whispers of those who had once suffered under the creature's curse, now at peace. She didn't rise immediately. She allowed herself to rest, to breathe in the crisp, clean air, free from the suffocating grip of the darkness. The fight was over, but the future of White Hollow, of herself, was just beginning. For the first time in a long while, Evelyn felt hope.